Bonjour à tous.
Good morning to all of you. So please take a seat. We will start very shortly our discussion. Thanks a lot. It's always a great pleasure to welcome you here today, to talk with you, to discuss with you in this tent as part of the Rencontres Economiques de Aix-en-Provence. For this session, we are delighted to welcome Zak Atali, the president of Atelli Associates and Positive, and Alexis Tsipras, the former Greek prime minister. We will be talking about a thrilling topic, a topical issue. How can we reconcile politicians and economists? It's a broad topic, some would say. And I will ask you the same question that will be the thread of our discussions. Why there's a lack of understanding? We could even say that there are some disputes between the economic world and political circles, and it has always been the case. Alexis Tsipras, what is your take on that? What is your viewpoint, this lack of understanding between the two worlds?
So please take your headphones.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for inviting me, and I will answer your question immediately.
Alors, en attendant que vous ayez tous un petit traducteur pour comprendre.
So while you grab the headsets, so that you can understand this language, this nice language, we will listen to Mr. Atali. It's very difficult to speak when you have some people who are popping in and popping out. But why economists and politicians do not agree, why they don't see eye to eye? They have something that they all share, i.e., whatever the opinion on any topic, I will find a politician who see eye to eye with a point. So politics and economics are not sciences. None of them. But if you consider history and geography, these are sciences. So we need to move away from this myth whereby you have people who are subjective, i.e. the politicians, and people who are serious, who are wise, who are politicians. Of course, you have experimental science, hard science. So I'm stating the obvious, but science is not in the economic field, and economics is not a science. But you need to take into account the economic reality, and there are some constraints upon the politicians. You have the constraints of dearth, in fact. You have to consider the limits of demographics, geopolitics. You have to consider the different contexts. In a given context, politicians don't have the same room for maneuver in terms of freedom that he or she could hope for. So there's a dangerous common point between the two. Very often, economics is based on the short term, the markets that will take actions according to the short term, and the politicians will take actions taking into account the polls and the elections that will take place on Sunday, the second round of the elections. And there is something that is pivotal today. How can we give the right to vote for the future generations? This is a matter for politicians and for the economists. How can they make sure that their actions are based upon the long term? So two questions have to be raised. Are there any people who have done better? And if I take a decision, what will be the impact in 30 years' time? So we need to raise those two issues from an economic viewpoint and from a political viewpoint. And politicians and economists, focus on the short term. So Zak Atelli, you've described the situation. Alexis Tsipras, what do you think of this misunderstanding, and maybe how can we remedy that situation, the lack of understanding between politicians and economists? Oscar Wilde once said that technocrats know everything about prices, but nothing about values. So economists, technocrats, they are knowledgeable about the price of things, but they don't consider the genuine value of things. When I talk about value, the value of democracy, the value of common goods, social justice, morality in politics, the value of solidarity. So I'm convinced that, of course, it is of critical importance to get technocrats, economists with us. But at the same time, we can't have a policy that is based on technocrats' views and economists' diktats. There's another criterion that is pivotal regarding our actions and the way the actions are shaped. It's very difficult to make a distinction between politicians and economists. You've talked about disputes, lack of understanding. It's a wrong distinction. I think that politicians need to get a vision, but at the same time, politicians need to understand the short, mid, and long term of policies. Stability is key. So economy is everything. So if I were to paraphrase Keynes, you have some politicians who think that they shouldn't listen to the economists. These politicians are people who are implementing obsolete economic theories. We have politicians and economists, and they focus on the short term. They want to be popular, and they look at the polls, and they tell what the people are ready to listen. So we have the big financial groups, and we have politicians with a vision. They think about the common good. You have some economists who don't look at the short-term interests. So it's important to get a kind of situation whereby common goods could be above our short-term interests. Cooperation between politicians and economists. Do you agree with that, Zak Atelli? There are people who do not focus on the long term, and they've realized their limitations. When you're a politician, when you are an economist, you have some limitations. As Alexis Tsipras said, we could reconcile politicians and economists' answer. If you consider the political action, there are some constraints that need to be taken into account. As I said, and as Alexis pointed out, you have physical constraints, material constraints, not only economic constraints. There are some political constraints. When you are in a democracy, you are accountable to the people, so you can't do anything. Very often I turn to economists, to take a decision for a president of the Republic. So we brought together the top 12 French economists with 12 contradictory statements. So far, I've qualified the validity of economists. But is it healthy to have 12 different viewpoints? Yes, it is quite healthy. There's no such thing as an all-encompassing truth. So economists will provide you with some insights into the concepts mentioned by Alexis: public, private goods, the law of the market, general services. These are concepts that have been formalized for the past 2 centuries according to the different economic theories. Economic theories play a key role in terms of political decision-making. Today, what is at stake is the debate between market, democracy, and dictatorship. So if you consider the market, so the market prevailed in order to distribute private goods. So for the distribution of private goods, the market rules the roost. But for the distribution of public goods, some economists will think that the market is better, everything should be privatized. And there is no clear border. That's why politics plays a key role to set the boundaries between public goods and private goods. What could be a public service that is free of charge, being paid by taxes, and what should be paid by consumers, even though you can offset the process with taxes and subsidies. So this is a political issue. What is the common good? What is the private good? Once this decision has been made, economists play a key role to deliver a message to politicians. There are some external constraints to take into account, but at the same time, they cannot impose too many things. The economists played an excessive role during the European construction. For example, they collided with politicians, or they colluded with politicians. Competition was key for them. So why did they collude with politicians? Any voter is a consumer, above all, but only 1/3 or of the voters are workers. So consumers and voters, they vote against workers. And if you consider the European construction, it was shaped in favor of consumers at the expense of voters. And when competition was considered to be a benefit, lots of people feel good about it. And in fact, Europe is an open field at a global scale. So bear witness the Henri Paoletta report, but you have the competition-based economy and the prevalence of the consumer, of the voter, was a disaster. Before I hand over to you, of course, I would like you to take part in this discussion. Lots of things have been said by Zak Αταλί, Mr. Tsipras. For example, the involvement and role of the market. If you consider the combination of politicians and economists, so what is the role of the market, in fact?
Νομίζω ότι ο ρόλος της αγοράς είναι λίγο πολύ γνωστός.
I think that we all know what the role of the market is, what the markets want. Markets want to make ever greater levels of profits. We're talking about bodies that are profit-making organizations. That's the role of the market. Their role is to earn more and more money, earn as much money as possible by any means possible, with very often a very significant political and social cost. My question is rather to say, what is the role of politics? What's the role of politicians? How can we create a counterweight, counterbalance to avoid attacking democracy? I understand today that politics has changed. The time of François Mitterrand was so different to ours. France's policy was so different to what is possible today. But orthodox financial reasoning that says that markets are always right is not always right. The Liz Truss experiments in the UK, well, in that case, we can say that the markets were right. They played an important role. But in 1983, with the French franc, the markets weren't right. And in the case of the Greek debt crisis, the markets were wrong. They wanted an analysis which looked at the German economy and the Greek economy in the same light, on the same level. They were wrong. They played a game of poker and they got it wrong. And that's why I think that politicians need to create a counterweight. Quantitative easing may be a kind of counterweight. It can sometimes combat the negative effects of the market. I think we need to take into account macroeconomic data, and in order to do so, we need to ensure that we have policies that create wealth. This is the second important point. Wealth needs to be distributed in a fair way with fair taxation. In order to do so, we need to combat and confront the powerful interests in our countries. That's why we cannot say that the right wing and the left wing are the same thing. We can't say that all politicians are the same. We need to create wealth and ensure fair redistribution. The taxation system needs to be fair, and I would repeat what I say. We need to be ready to confront the major interests in our nations. We need to be sure that we are ready for this confrontation. We can't always be the kind and nice person. Thank you very much. Your message has been very clear, Alexis Tsipras. So we're now going to hand over to people on the floor. There are some microphones around. So please raise your hand and ask a question. We've got about 5 minutes for questions and answers. 5 minutes for you. If you don't have any questions, I got some. We are talking about economists, but are we generalizing things too much? My question is for Mr. Αταλί. Are there not some economists that are too close to the interests of large firms? They don't produce economic discourse, but a discourse that's in the interest of certain people, certain interests. Yes, that's what I was saying earlier. There's always an economist to defend every type of opinion, because there are all sorts of opinions. I won't say that an economist who's working within a particular company has lost his or her freedom of expression. We're confusing two issues here. The supposed position between economists and politicians, and the different position between the economist and the market. Politics is one thing, but the market is a reality. There is a challenge when an economist wants to combat the market. An economist might be able to do this if he is powerful. To be powerful, he will need to be rich. So that's why, by its very nature, the European construction seeks to go beyond the constraints of the markets, and I think we have made some progress in this direction. If we want to go beyond the constraints of the market, history tells us that we need to be either very small, like Singapore, or very big, like USA, China, Russia, and maybe one day Europe. This is a big discussion between market and the state, and we need to distinguish here between democracies and dictatorships. So there are economists who are used in different ways. They have ideological biases. Each one of us, whether we're historians, geographers, or sociologists, whatever we are, we need to have a critical way of thinking. Thank you, Zak Atalí. My name is Josh Rosenberg. I've got a question about that comes back from a previous panel in room number 2. It talked about Europe, which is an economic, budgetary, a fiscal dwarf. So, two questions. What did we miss in building Europe in the 1970s and 1980? And with what's going on Sunday, is there anything that will enable Europe to emerge as a continent that's able to combat China and the USA? First of all, two very obvious answers. In Europe, we're doing something that's only been achieved once successfully, that is to build a country from bottom up. Generally, countries are built top down. You have a dictator, a conqueror that brings territories together. France was brought together by a conqueror. And Europe, we have a lot of nations that have dreamed of being the emperors of the world for a while, and sometimes they were the emperors. With Europe, we're trying to build differently, bottom up, and the only example that has worked in this way is Switzerland, which has built bottom up, but they took 4 centuries to do so. Why did they do that? Because they were afraid of an emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor in the German states, and they built in that way for this reason. But we don't have this time. We have competitors, enemies even, that are trying to pillage the richest areas of the world. The USA, China, Russia are trying to pillage and loot in our territories, and that's why this discussion is not economic. The question is, will we be afraid enough of our decline in order to build a European political entity that will withstand? And that requires something right now that is not economic. It requires a European army. Why haven't we done this? I'm old enough to have been around at the start of the construction of the European Monetary Union. We started with a Franco-German brigade, and we hoped that in the end of the 1980s it would lead to a European army. 40 years later, there's still not been one. Why? Because the American ally has been influencing things to ensure that the political and most of all a military Europe has not been built. It's against their interest, in my view, because it would be in their interest to have a true power in Europe. But I nonetheless remain relatively optimistic, because I think we're starting to understand this very simple sentence. We are on our own. When you're on your own in life or in public life, you have to react. Alexis, Tsipras, a final word on Europe. We've gone well beyond the initial framework of the debate, but could you tell us a little bit about Europe? The question from the floor was very interesting in this regard. First of all, I would like to say that Europe has achieved something that's very important. For decades, almost to 70 years, we've lived in prosperity and in peace. Right now, we're in the throes of a very significant crisis, and we will need to change our approach, first of all, by deepening our political union, and secondly, by ensuring military autonomy. We live in a multipolar world, a very complex world, and in such a world we need to ensure strategic autonomy. Sometimes our interests are the same as those of the USA, but sometimes it's not the case. When we have different interests from those of the USA, we need to be able to defend those interests. Our interests need to be founded on our major European values: peace, democracy, liberty and justice. And that's why I believe that at various levels we are going to need to rethink what the right approach to history should be. What's history? Which story are we going to choose? How can we play a role in the world's conflicts? Social justice and democracy are important. We need to ensure we reduce inequality within our European Union countries, but also the inequalities between member countries, because this is what is strengthening the far right. The far right is a threat to us, and it may lead to Europe being destabilized and jeopardizing Europe's futures. This is a real danger. Thank you. Perhaps that's a subject that will bring politicians and economists together. Thank you very much to both of you. Before I let you go, I want to just say that Zak Αταλί will be signing his book at 12:30 at the Fnac bookshop in Parc Jourdan. So that's going to be in just a few minutes' time if you want to go and get a signature. Thank you very much for everyone for attending this discussion. See you soon.